Hello and welcome to the third episode of my 2023 Rugby World Cup preview series. We round out the main contenders in Pool A by looking at Ireland's opponents in this weekend's warm-up game, Italy. With Kieran Crowley having one foot out the door, can the New Zealander lead the Azzurri to their finest World Cup hour and leave his successor a youthful squad brimming with confidence? Or will it be further pool stage woes for the Italians? With me to look ahead to Italy's tournament prospects are two new guests to this pod. They are 2/3 of the English-speaking Italian rugby podcast Fratelli de Rugby. So welcome on to Marcello, Cossali-Francis and Mike Petretta. Pleasure to have you on, lads.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
No worries at all. First of all, before we get into the game this weekend, the World Cup is about 5 weeks away now. So how are you feeling about it? Are you excited, nervous? I'll come to yourself first, Mike.
I'm quite excited. I think we're in a position where there's not too much pressure, and I think we've been playing some exciting rugby. So yeah, just keen on seeing sort of how the product progresses. I'm really excited about it.
And yourself, Marcel?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure we're even allowed to be nervous, really, given the group we've got. It's almost a bit like it'd almost be a bit cheeky of us to be nervous, expecting anything less than a third place finish. Ultimately, I think we're in the situation we have been in a few years where third place is sort of the expectation, but also the minimum requirement. So I feel we're fine. This is probably the first time, especially in my lifetime, that we're going into a World Cup where there's that little bit of expectation that maybe we could do it. I think if we'd have had a kind of draw, I'd have been feeling really quite, I am excited, but really sort of anxious about it, because there's sort of that little bit more pressure on us and expectation on us now to start turning performances into results. But we've got New Zealand and France, so it's not exactly the easiest pool. So yeah, I'm like Mike, I'm excited to see what we can do in the next few weeks and then the build up to the World Cup. And then once the World Cup comes, I'm just wanting to see us play the rugby we've been playing in the last 12 months, and wherever that takes us is good enough for me.
Yeah, that's understandable. And listen, I think this can speak for a lot of people in this country that would love to see Italy do well, not just because of the quarterfinal draw, but just it would be a great story. But the odds are stacked against them. They did return to the field last week with a clash against Scotland and Murrayfield. Fell short in that one, ultimately, on the two heavily rotated teams. So, Mike, I'll come to you first on this one. Do you want to just take us through that game, just from an Italian perspective, for those who didn't see it? Because it was a bit of a kerfuffle trying to figure out what channel it was on over here. So, do you want to just take us through that?
Yeah, of course. I don't think it was the prettiest game by any stretch. I think having seen the product from sort of the Rugby Championship over the past couple of weeks, and this is the first game of the season. There's a lot of players that just returned from holiday, and it is what I expected. I think sort of the torrid weather as well played its part. It was torrential rain and sunshine and wind, typical Scottish summer. So it was an interesting game. I think it was defined by the set piece. I think it was very much an arm wrestle. There was points where we seemed on top, and then as the game progressed, it looked like the Scottish got the better of us. And I think that's sort of, in the end, what really helped them win, as well as some beautiful kicks, some fantastic sort of 50-22s, and they played the territory really well. But I think from our side, from an Italian perspective, we put in a lot of reserve players who are first teamers, but haven't had a lot of time up onto Ioane and Toa Halafihi, who's just come back from injury as well. And we played some fantastic players out of position. Pani had his test start at fullback against Scotland, and we had Marcello, who we know could be a fantastic player for us, playing at outside centre and have the defensive responsibilities, which is a little bit different. So yeah, it was a mixed bag. I think if you wanted me to define it, a mixed bag. And I think from a Scottish perspective, I'm sure a Scottish fan will say exactly the same thing. Very mixed bag in terms of whom they played and how they played.
Okay, so a mixed bag for you. For Marcello, I'll come to you for this one. Like Ireland play Italy at the weekend, we probably don't really know what to expect. Is there anything we can take away from that game, or is it just a case of rotated team, first game out, just it gets its own category?
Yeah, I mean, look, if we were in a Six Nations tournament and we knew that the best team was going to be put out each week, then maybe Ireland would have something to think about. But these warm-ups are precisely about that. I think it's all about each team, just the cliche, focusing on yourselves and not really worrying too much about the opponent. I feel even if Italy played, if we played our strongest side against Ireland, and like we did in the Six Nations, we played a slightly rotated Ireland side and pushed them really close. So I think Ireland will be wary of what we're capable of doing. However, the team, whilst it might be stronger and a few more of those sort of regular names involved at the weekend, I still expect there to be a couple of rotation players in there as well. So I'm not sure Ireland can take too much from it. I think maybe the standout thing for me was Manuel Zuliani in the back row, and he sort of laid down a real marker. And I think should he be given another go at the weekend, at the breakdown, he was a monster really, and he will certainly go head to head with anyone in that Irish back row. So they might have to think a little bit about that breakdown. And I think the defence that we produced last weekend against Scotland was good, especially around the breakdown and sort of in defence and flashing up and making it difficult for Scotland to play. So I think we'll try and do the same thing again in trying to make it difficult for Ireland to play. We're probably going to see less of the ball than we did against Scotland, so it's probably going to be a bit more of a fitness test for us, which is obviously what we need. We need these games to be sort of different every time we play a game in the warm-ups. So yeah, I'm not sure Ireland will take too much from it. But yeah, I think hopefully, fingers crossed for everyone involved, it's a competitive one.
Well, for people who paid quite a bit of money to get in there, but that's a different conversation for other people. But I suppose the intriguing thing about this World Cup, lads, and probably get mentioned ad nauseum between now and October, is the coaching situation, not just with Italy, but with England, Wales, New Zealand, Australia, so many teams. And like this was probably the first of a sitting duck game for Kieran Crowley, remarkably. I'll come back to you for this one, Marcello, because do you want to take us through the whole Kieran Crowley situation for those who may not be familiar? And then we'll just get your thoughts on it afterwards then.
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk you through it logically, but to me, it doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. I think I hadn't really thought about it until now, and I can feel my blood boiling already talking about it again. It's devastating is probably the correct words to use. To be honest, Italy were going somewhere. We've seen in the last 12 months what we've been capable of and what we were sort of moving towards, and that's sort of been cut short. The federation want to go another direction, and that direction is Quesada come the end of the World Cup. They obviously had him in mind, and that's where they wanted to go. They wanted to bring in a new, younger coach, to someone who could maybe carry that mantle that what Kieran had sort of created. But yeah, he wanted to sign a new contract. He wanted to stay with Italy until the next Rugby World Cup cycle at least. But essentially, the federation said no and got rid of him and didn't even give him another Six Nations really. So he'll carry out his contract until the Rugby World Cup, and then that'll be it. And Quesada will come in next for the Six Nations, which is crazy, bonkers, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and there's no point brushing over. We can tell your thoughts on the whole situation there, and I'll throw it over to yourself now, Mike. Like, is this? You can give me your thoughts first, but is this just a mistake from the Italian Rugby Federation? Do you feel like obviously it's too soon to say because there hasn't even got a training session yet, but do you feel like this is a bit of a slip up from them?
Yeah, I think I never say absolutes. So as far as my personal feeling right now, we can see like that we're improving game on game, and rugby is built on marginal gains, and an inch further, an inch better, kick percentage better. All of these things contribute to winning games, and we're definitely in the upward, trajectory, and we're going in the right direction. We even saw that with, like I said, third, fourth choices at times at the weekend. And if we're able to build a team and a style of play and attack and more importantly, like an identity, which I think has been lacking in Italian rugby for so long, it's really difficult to sort of determine whether that's because of the group of players and the young talent that's coming through and all of the energetic youthfulness that has come from the under-20s over a period of years, or if it's something that's come directly from Crowley. What I will say is, March and I have been fortunate enough to interview a lot of the Italian boys over the past few months and weeks, and the way they speak about Kieran Crowley, and even when we interviewed Kieran Crowley himself, the way he spoke about the boys and like what it meant to him, we know what it means to him. And that's not to say that, Quesada's not going to come in and absolutely, go along the same sort of trajectory and utilize the same sort of game plan. And we're still seeing this attractive Italian rugby, and there's some nuances which change and we see results. That's not to say that doesn't happen, but it's a risk because we don't know, whereas we know what we're getting with Kieran Crowley. So if you're risk adverse, which I am, yes, it's a mistake. If you want to see sort of what the future holds and you're happy to play risks, which I don't think as Italian fans we have the opportunity to, because we don't have much money in the bank with results, then I think it's tough for us.
It's a weird one, because I think sometimes a bit of outside perspective is good with these conversations. And here in Ireland, it came as a massive shock. Like, we've seen what Kieran Crowley did with Benetton, the Pro 14, the Rainbow Cup, and for him to not get that extension is surprising, to say the least. And like, I suppose we're going to get into the Six Nations anyway, so I might as well start into it now. Like, there's been an awful lot of kind of annoying narrative conversations about them, or yes, they've come last 8 years in a row, but it's not the same. Like, it's not as easy as just putting it that way. Like, it's 6 of 6 good teams, and they are improving. And I'll start with yourself in this one, Marcello. We'll come back to Mike in a minute. Like, how much can the average person who would watch Six Nations, how much can they use that to judge Italy, really, when you are looking at 5 of the top 8 teams in the world? Or do you believe, say, is a World Cup stage a clearer picture where they're going to have a chance against Uruguay and Namibia, and if they're in another group, they could be going off against Georgia, for instance?
Yeah, I think the Six Nations, I've always said, especially in the last few years, when the conversations around promotion, relegation, Georgia, etc. have been talked about, is we've always been progressing the last 3-4 years. The problem is that it hasn't been as the incline hasn't been as great as it has been for Scotland or France or Ireland, who have obviously got a lot more at their disposal than we have. Their progression has just been quicker, and we haven't been able to progress at the same pace. But we're now at that stage where this last Six Nations, and maybe the final 2 games of the previous Six Nations, where we sort of ended really well against Scotland and then went beat Wales. We had the really good autumn, and this was probably the one Six Nations where we didn't win a game, but I think we were probably in a position to win at least 3 of those games. And I do wonder, going back to the Crowley conversation just very quickly, had we managed to turn 1 or 2 of those into a win, what might have happened? I guess for the Federation, it was much easier to get rid of Crowley on the back of losing all 5 games and finishing bottom of the Six Nations. We were probably reffed out a couple of them as well, let's be said, especially the Scotland game. We should have won that one. But that's the thing. That's what Mike says, and Mike talks about it. I like the fine margins in rugby. If you don't, that's the difference between winning and losing, isn't it? So the Six Nations is difficult. Yes, we've coming up against the best teams in the world ultimately, and this World Cup, we're now in a position where we're expected to beat certain sides. and we should be beating these sides if we are to talk about ourselves the way we do talk about ourselves. And what's nice to see is that some of those warm-up games are going to provide us with the chance to, hopefully, fingers crossed, get some wins under our belt and hopefully go into a World Cup campaign with some winning momentum, which is sort of, we don't really get all that often. And a lot of the times we play the Six Nations and we then go and play a summer test against South Africa or New Zealand or something crazy like that, when we're obviously never going to win, and get to an autumn on the back of 6, 7, 8 defeats in the space of a year. So it'll be nice. And I think this World Cup is something we can be judged on. But I think ultimately it'll be how far can we push one of or both New Zealand and France ultimately. And I think those two games is where we should be judged, not necessarily by the result, but more the performance and how we fare in those kind of really big games.
Yeah. No, do you want to take the same question there, Mike, about, is it, sorry, I've lost my notes here in front of me.
Is it doom and gloom for the Six
No,
Nations?
not doom and gloom, but like, is the World Cup a clear picture? Like, the one thing that came to my head when I was making up these notes was, what if we had the same format as the under-20s? Where would Italy lie then? I'm not saying the amount of teams, but just that kind of an idea. Like, maybe we wouldn't be as defeatist on Italy because they were good in 2019. They could have taken, I'm not going to say they could have taken Scotland. Scotland were poor that year. They could have taken Fiji. They could have picked off a scalp if we had a different format, for instance. Six Nations just allows that.
Well, I'll go back to the Six Nations and I'll progress into the World Cup because I think they're both very relevant points. I think where we're at now is from 2017 when we had Conor O'Shea and Stephen Aboud set up the academies. This is the fruition 5 years on, because obviously this is the fifth season, I should say, excuse me, coming into the sixth season. And look at who we brought in from our current team, from those iterations. So we've got, Marcello, Lamaro, Fischetti, Riccione. We like basically our whole team this cycle has been youthful players that we've capped, and they've only recently been churned through the system because we didn't have an effective system before that. So we had a really effective system. Obviously, it's recently changed with one of the centers of formation changing and being removed, and sort of more funds going across sort of the top 10 to try and bring the standard of the top 10 up, because that needs to be the healthy sort of growing ground of the of our sort of young under 20s, under 18s. That so if we're talking about the Six Nations, I think actually if we're going to start judging Italy, we need to judge them from the point where the academies have been set up and we've been in the same position that the other top the other Six Nation sides have been in for a longer period of time. So there's that side. So with your response to the under 20s, for us, this is sort of the acid test, like moving in from the under 20s to the national team. How do they transition? It's the same issue, I suppose, every team has, but it's more difficult for us because we only have 2 franchises. That said, obviously, I know it's a very common issue with Ireland as well. And if we're talking about the World Cup, yeah, I think the ranking system definitely needs to maybe have a little look at, because we're in a position where we're in 2019 up against New Zealand and South Africa, and this year we're up against the other favourites in Ireland and France. And I think if we're constantly in a position where we're up against the best teams, of course we're not going to make the pools. But then in the same vein, it's such a perfect stage to write history and really show who we are and what we want to do. And I think speaking to the boys this year, that's what they want. That's the target.
It would be great to see. No one would take it off them. And it just, when I hear you talk about almost going to flipping the lid on the Six Nations narrative that some people put out there, I kind of wish he had Irish TV coverage. I don't know if you can get it, but Ian McKinley, former Italian player, has been banging the drum for years about Italy are improving. And it has been good to hear, because a lot of the other conversation isn't great. And it's good to hear your perspective on it as well, which is something I'd agree with. I do think there is scope there for improvement as much as Anton. And you talk about that young squad, like I don't have the exact list in front of me, but it is predominantly a younger squad. You look at Garbisi, Capozzo, Lamuro, guys you can build around. And anyone who watches URC or Top 14 on a religious basis will see that these are exciting players. And I suppose before we get into your thoughts on the overall, the extended squad, if you will, and I'll bounce it back to you, Mike, again this time. Do you want to just take us through the key players, the exciting players? Because again, and not mean to be disrespectful to people listening, but a lot of people won't watch an awful lot of, say, Benetton or Top 14, or, you know, to be that familiar with these guys.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I think there's a few players that we can highlight. There's some players who are exciting unknowns, and there's some players who probably have progressed over time. So, you know, like there was Rutsa who captained at the weekend. And for those of you who don't watch the URC, obviously he's a staple at Benetton. He played at blindside as opposed to lock, where he's prominently playing for both Italy and Benetton. But he's a player who, over the past 2 seasons, I think if he wasn't Italian and he was playing in a more successful team, he'd probably be well known in sort of the rugby sphere. So there's certainly someone like him, and even a player like Nicodera, who had like a very slow and gradual progression, but he's, you know, verging on first choice with Lucchesi, who's been injured, unfortunately. So there's players like that who have improved under the Crowley regime over, you know, a long period of time. And obviously credit to like Bortolami and Mazzi and co in Benetton as well. And then there's players who have incredible potential. And I brought up Marcello, and I know he's a pod favorite for me, and Marcello, but he could potentially be one of like Italy all-time greats. He's 20 years old. He's so destructive, and he's a malleable, you know, he's a versatile, malleable player. So someone like him, who's maybe not on everyone's tongue, but people are starting to realize how good he is. And I think as well, you know, Martin Page-Rello, we're very lucky that he chose Italy. I know he was approached by France as well. Obviously French born, and plays in the top 14, and he was recently behind Dupont at Toulouse. So obviously he has a good mentor. But he's like a very versatile player, probably a player that people you know, don't necessarily know unless, you know, you watch a lot of the top 14. Can play fullback, wing, and obviously he's a 9 by trade. He's a player. And then again, like Mark said, Zuliani and Lamaro, and I think Cannone, those guys have you know, almost proven themselves in this short period of time. And like I said, one big shout out to Seb Negri, who probably played his best season at 28 years old. He's hitting his prime, and he just looks really good. So there's a number of players that, if you weren't aware, those are the players that probably stand out. And then, like I said, you know, there's the Fischetti, who you know, so passionate, puts his body on the line, like runs himself ragged. Riccioni, who's an animal as well. So there's plenty of players to look out for. But if you want sort of ones that could potentially light up and be world beaters, I think Menoncello, Lamaro, those are the boys who are the safe bets.
And it's great to see, like, again, bounce back to that point, it's great to see this young talent coming through. And I before I come on to omissions from the squad and all that with yourself, Marcelo, I just want to throw it back to you, Mike, about the younger crop. Like I was looking it up there around the time of the under-26 nations. Like, Italy have been consistently 5th or above for 5-6 years now. You got lads like Garbisi, Lamuro, Capozzo, Menoncello, who you mentioned. Brex is certainly finding his feet to URC level quite comfortably. Like, is it, I suppose, I don't want to say is it a sense of national pride or anything, but is there a sense of, if these young lads are given a proper level to grow on, and like Garbisi has that at Montpellier, for instance, Capozzo at Toulouse, that they could really bring Italian rugby into a not a golden generation again, because that's too high of a marking point for them, but to really push Italian rugby on, because like the quality is there. Benetton are a better team markedly than they were 5 or 6 years ago. So is there room to be excited nearly at all this array of young players coming through?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think Italy suffer from the same issue that Ireland suffer, whereby we produce too much talent for the teams that we have. So there's plenty of, young Irish talent which isn't getting much game time because, unfortunately, there's only so many spaces on the team. So if you're going to integrate young players, where are you going to do it? Obviously, the URC doesn't have the Premiership Cup like the UK, or I should say just the Premiership, because obviously it's not Anglo-Welsh anymore. And, for us, I think, that causes a big problem, which is the transition. So where are these boys getting game time? And Zebre have been brave. Like, candidly, they've been brave. They've been playing 20-year-old props against, well-seasoned props. And everyone knows that, props hit their prime sort of later on, even up to sort of 30 years old. So these boys, they're never, they're never expected to compete, but they are expected to improve. And there's some fantastic players like Nocera, who hasn't been picked, unfortunately, but he's someone who I fully expect to light up at tight head for us. And this is where these boys are getting game time. So if we're going to be talking about our under 20s, there's plenty of players who have the potential to reach another level. And I think this is where the federation needs to make a concerted effort to try and attract foreign teams. So I mean, sort of top 14 Premiership sides, etc., and have some form of collaboration between the two, whereby we're inviting them into an academy system which is accommodating for their growth. They are getting some sort of game time, and I think that's sort of the next step. And I think if we're looking, we spoke about Georgia. If we're looking at Georgia, that's what Georgia have been doing. They set up an agreement with the Espors and all of the Georgian young talent just playing France, and you can see how it's benefiting them at obviously sort of national team level later on. So that's where we're at. We've got plenty of talent. We've been producing fantastic talent for a while. Obviously, we should have come third last year. We came third this year in the Six Nations. So it is on the upward trajectory. It's all good having these quality players. It's about sort of getting them game time, and that's the next step. And I suppose that's the piece of the puzzle which the federation need to get cracking on.
Absolutely. And I just a random quiz question here, because I'm after looking up there. Do you want to know when was the last time Italy came last in the under 20, or do you want to hemorrhage a guess at us?
2016.
2017, yeah. So that's a lot of growth in recent years. I know some of it is because Scotland rugby has had issues there, but it is, it's easy to look at, Italy lose to England in Rome and they're not doing well. But the reality is they are beating these teams at underage, and it's only a matter of time. Hopefully you'll start with someone else and not Ireland. And Marcello, we will come to you now for this one and the makeup of the squad. A lot of fans always go towards the omissions page as opposed to who's selected. So is there any big noteworthy omissions in the Italian squad, or is it kind of as expected, which a lot of teams have been for World Cup extended squads?
Yeah, I think our extended squad, there is no surprise omissions. I mean, there are a couple of injuries that are worth noting. Sort of Jake Pelledri, who I don't think he's been ruled out of the World Cup, but I'm sort of leaning towards thinking that I'd be surprised now if he did get into that squad. Even if he gets into the squad, I'm not sure how much we will see of Jake. Unfortunately, he's just been decimated with injuries, the poor bloke, over the last kind of 2-3 years, and it's obviously massive shame for us, given how well he was going, and kind of people talking about him at that 2019 World Cup as being one of the best flankers in the world, and so that was a huge shame. But ultimately, at least he's sort of fit-ish, and hopefully be able to go on to something post-rugby anyway. So obviously he's a blow. I think Eduardo Padovani, who would be a massive miss for us, is also out of the World Cup. He is someone that I think has been hugely underrated, especially in the Italian game. He is a player that can sort of play both wing and 15, and obviously his size makes him quite useful under the high ball, and gives us an attacking option as well as a defensive option. And me and Mike have talked about our wingers, and a lot of them sort of do the same thing. A lot of them do it quite well, and Ioane and Bruno, who are good in the contact and are quite industrious and score tries. But Padovani is someone that sort of kicks really well and is good under the high ball and defensively sound, and he offers us something a little bit different. So not having him is a blow as well. And I guess the only omission that people were sort of circling about is, of course, Sergio Parise, who obviously now retired anyway, but people were talking about him at the time as whether he obviously wanted to play. He wanted to do another World Cup, and his wife certainly did as well, by all accounts. But yeah, he was the only one that people were sort of debating over whether would he get in, would he not get in. But yeah, I mean, these World Cup squads are so big now that I don't think there are many sort of surprises in terms of, mind you, there seems to be debate over English players every single week, doesn't there? But who gets in and who doesn't get in and who should get in and who shouldn't be there. So, but as far as we're concerned, no, there aren't really any sort of omissions other than a couple of injuries.
That's no bad thing either, because all the top teams are pretty settled. It is a better chance of having a successful tournament with a settled squad. And even, I suppose, as we were kind of saying before, success could be measured on the warm-up games, and if they can pull off a big result in the warm-ups. And this Saturday they do travel to Dublin to take on Ireland. That's at 8:00 on RT2 for those here in Ireland. So we'll start with yourself on this one, Marcello. Just first and foremost, what do you think the aim is for Italy here? Is it just going to be a case of, get minutes into lads' legs, fitness, as you mentioned earlier? Or do you think they can potentially upset the apple cart a little bit, and or is that too far to be thinking?
I think of all the grounds, sort of Dublin and London are the places where it doesn't matter what form we're in or how confident we are. It just the fixture that I hate the most, actually, unfortunately, is Italy, Ireland in Dublin, because it's normally where we get tanked by 50, 60 points, or we have that awful situation we had a year ago where we had half the team sent off or for whatever reason. There's just so many sort of bad memories of playing in Dublin. Obviously, we've had some good ones playing in Rome in the last sort of 10, 15 years, but ultimately Dublin has never been a happy place for us to go. Look, I mean, these warm-up games you could win all of them and then go into the group stage at the World Cup and get knocked out. So it doesn't really matter. It's the same with pre-season in football, for example. Pre-season, those games don't really matter. It's all about sort of the performance. Now, I think we saw lots of encouraging signs against Scotland. I think our defence was really good and really sound, and we made it really difficult for Scotland to play. The task will be, can we do that against Ireland? And not many teams have been particularly successful at stopping Ireland, no matter how hard they've tried. And that's what makes them one of the best teams in the world and one of the favourites for the World Cup. So, I mean, we don't know what sort of teams they put out. Ireland could go really experimental and we could go quite strong, and therefore it might even us out a little bit. But for us, it's all about performance. Can we, I think, again, depending on who we pick in attack, in offence, can we see a little bit more slick than we did against Scotland? Obviously, the conditions didn't really help, and hopefully those conditions aren't repeated this weekend, and we get some time to put some of those attacking plays in that we know we can do, and we can play a little bit more rugby that is maybe suited to us, which hopefully can happen. But yeah, fitness, minutes in their legs. Again, and I've said to Mike, can we go and test ourselves against one of the best teams in the world prior to the World Cup? And if we get beaten by 30, 40 points, it ultimately won't matter. We don't expect to go there and win. We want to see progression. We want to see us gearing up towards a World Cup ultimately. And can we just go a couple of steps better than we did against Scotland? I feel like we'll probably have more of our first team players involved, so that should help with some stability and help with sort of looking a little bit more fluid compared to last week, which was slightly fractured at times. But yeah, these are just warm-up games for us. Can we build through Scotland and Ireland and hopefully be at our best or thereabouts against Romania and Japan? I think is the aim for us. And these first two games are very much, we probably won't have a lot of the ball fitness. We're going to make a lot of tackles. Can we sort of learn from that and develop on that? So I think that's the key for us. Let's just go there with an open mind, try and play rugby and see if we can stop Ireland playing there, which is easier said than done, of course. But I think that's sort of the aim for us, really.
Yeah. Apologies now, Mike. This might be a tougher question because I'm going to ask you more about the the combinations, the game plan. Like Italy, predominantly possession team, a very on-ball rugby type team, and as we've seen in recent years, and I don't want to say straying away from contact, but they don't have the biggest side. They have to play this more expansive game, and they do it quite well. So when it comes to their game plan and the attitude coming into the Ireland game, like we have to remember in Rome this year, they between the Canones and I can't remember who was at centre, so apologies there, and Garbisi, they really ran Ireland ragged at times in that first half in particular. They really frightened them. So is that something you're going to look for, or is it more, okay, let's see how X and Y do together in this combination or partnership? Like because again, it's a balancing act, these games, but Ireland are one of the best teams. You measure yourself against the best.
Exactly. So the word acid test comes to mind. I think we're in a position now where, like you said, the settled teams are typically the teams that end up doing really well in tournaments, the ones that have had some continuity and consistency with selection. And I think actually we're in a position where there's probably 5 or 6 positions up for grabs at this stage of a cycle, which is relatively uncommon. And I think, if we're looking at Ireland, for example, I think, there might be a few, probably half of the opportunities available for people to get on the plane. So we're at a position where I think we know, are the best in principle, or in theory, I should say, our team. But I think there's definitely some positions which are up for grabs. And, I was pleasantly surprised by the combination of Murisi at 12 and Marcello at 13. And then Mori came on against Scotland, and, he played just different. He was just a different player from what we've seen before. And he seemed far more competent and comfortable at 12. So there's an element of, okay, if he can do that against, I think it was Callum Redpath came on at the same time, who, is a well-established centre. So if we can do that against, a relatively well-established centre at international level, what can we do against the best team in the world? So that's actually the point where we're like, right, okay, let's put these combinations in place. Let's have this acid test and see sort of where we're at with our depth as well, because I'm sure Ireland will be coming in with same sort of mentality. They're not going to be putting out and out first team. They're probably going to be putting out some players which require some time. So we'll be doing something very similar, but with the intention of learning. Like, it should be a learning experience for us. It shouldn't just be, these players need minutes in their legs, crack on, see how you get on. It should be, okay, right, we've been in a position where we've seen Morty for 30 minutes against Scotland. Let's see what you can do for 50 minutes. Let's see, where people start depleting. Let's understand the depth of our team. Let's understand, the fitness levels. Let's understand, where we're at as a team, and then we can actually be in a position where we're growing in the next 2 games. So the lead up, with Japan and Romania, we should be looking at, okay, we should build into the World Cup. Those are 2 games that we're expected to win. And it's going to be very important how we win those games. And I think the expectation is that we can take as much as we possibly can from Scotland. And I think we're going to be taking away a lot more, because I do think it's going to be a tough game for us at the weekend. But if we can learn from that and then build into the World Cup, then, we're fortunate enough that we've got France and New Zealand as our last 2 games. So, anything can happen at that point if we remain fit, and, a couple injuries or suspensions here and there from the other team. It could be a different game. So that's where we're at, I think. Yeah.
But just I don't think there's anything for us to lose this weekend. Ultimately, I think worst case scenario, we get beaten heavily, and it's another massive learning curve for us. We become, like Mike said, you learn things from it. So if we get beaten really, really convincingly, we go back to drawing board, we go back to training the next week and see what we didn't do well, or because ultimately Ireland are, best team in the world, you could say. So we're probably not going to come up against a better side than that. So, if we can take anything from that game against Ireland, which I'm sure we will, that's going to put us in really good stead for those games against Japan and Romania, even if we do get beaten by 50 points. That's something that can only really benefit this group. I don't think there's any scenario in which anything becomes really negative. So that's something for us to think of as well. And like Mike said, we can win those 2 warm-up games against Japan and Romania, and then we get through those games that we need to get through in the group stage at Rugby World Cup. Then ideally for us, we come up against New Zealand and France, no expectation, no pressure. We've secured our 3rd place. We've secured our place in the next World Cup. We've done what we've needed to do and what we've had to do. Then we can just sort of throw caution to the wind and say, right, whatever else is a complete and utter bonus. Let's see if we can cause one of the biggest shocks of World Cup history.
And it would be great to see. And to be quite honest, Marcello, you're kind of taking the entire next question of my point about what's kind of the aims and what would be a good World Cup. So I'll change it slightly for yourself, Mike, if you don't mind. First of all, what would be a good World Cup like? But can they dream of a scalp? Can they dream of a quarterfinal? Or even before they go into the World Cup, Japan, Romania, before they play Uruguay and Namibia, the opportunity to get 4 wins under their belts. Is that as much as anything as enticing? The fact that they could really go into, I excuse me if I'm wrong, I think is it the French game 3rd? So like the opportunity they go into that full of confidence for a change. Like
I think we play France last, actually. I think that's the last game.
That's less than ideal. So, but
I think so.
the point still stands though. Like the idea of having got up a run of momentum, is that nearly as important as, because 3rd, really, they should finish 3rd.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know about dreaming of a scalp, but the boys genuinely 100% believe that they can put a hurting on both teams. And this isn't, just from one person. It's from, pretty much every single person we've spoken to over the past few weeks, including Kieran Crowley. It almost sounds like they know something we don't. Like that's very much the mannerisms in which they speak about those games and the confidence that they speak about those games. And I've seen a lot of interviews with Italian players over my years watching them, but they genuinely believe it. So I think, yes, absolutely, you're right. I think if we can go in with 4 wins, particularly getting the win over Japan, albeit they're ranked higher than us. I think we are favourites for that game because it's at home. We're coming into a position where rankings are going to be very important over the next year or two because of the same issues we've alluded to right at the start of this podcast. So yes, 4 wins would be brilliant. And then, like Marcello said, it's any given Sunday. If we've secured 3rd and we're in a position where we feel like we can make stuff difficult for some of the best teams in the world, and if we can keep in touch until the end. We saw what happened against Wales the year before last, and I know obviously we're talking very different kettle of fish, but we were written off that game, and we played probably some of our best rugby. So yes is the answer. I think we probably will be targeting those games, and I think that's probably something where we potentially could do a lot of damage.
Yeah, and just an extension of that as well, kind of from a neutral observer, maybe you've picked up this yourselves, probably the big disappointment looking from afar at Italy this year was the fact that in the game that they most expect to do well in was the Wales game. It looked forced. It looked like the pressure kind of got to them a small bit. Would that be a bit of a fear that if they do win their opening 2 games, Namibia and Uruguay, that possibly that could be a bit of a factor as well? And we did kind of see that in 2019 as well, when against South Africa, they started okay and then they just kind of fell away. Now South Africa won the World Cup. I'm not comparing them to Wales of this year, but is that a bit of a worry? And whichever one he wants to jump in there.
Yeah, I don't think it's, well, I mean, you could say it's a worry, and I think we've seen it before. We saw it when we beat Wales and then followed that up with losing to Georgia, and it was, who else did we play, Mike? I've forgotten me now. Who we scraped past? Who did we scrape
Portugal.
past? Portugal.
Yeah, Portugal, and then we beat Romania the following game.
So it was we did those two games after beating Wales, and we saw it again this year going into a game. finally, sort of first time in maybe a long time, going into a Six Nations game with a lot of people saying that we were favourites, and we didn't handle that very well. And I think we also saw that at the under-20 championship this year as well, in the fact we went into that Georgia game having beaten South Africa and targeting a semi-final spot, and ending up almost being relegated. So as a whole, I think Italian rugby is young. I think obviously the under-20s are young given they're an age grade team, but our first team is also young, which, so the positive of that is they're fearless. And like Mike said, when they're coming to the World Cup, they will be the first people to turn around and say, we're not surprised if we beat France or New Zealand, for example. And there's the negative of that is also that there's their lack of experience when it comes to being favourites. How do you handle that? And that's a lot of it is mentally more than physically. And we've spoken to some boys, and they've told us how there's been quite a lot of a focus on that mental side of things, and how can we prepare ourselves to be better in those situations when there is expectation and there is pressure on us to perform. And that'll be the key for us. I think I'd like to think Namibia and Uruguay, even if we're sort of under par and we're not great, we're still probably going to come through those games. But for us, it will be, we need to win those games and win them well. We need to take 10 points from those games, but you can't go into a game thinking about how many tries can we score and thinking about a bonus point victory before you've won the game itself. So that is the key for us, and that is something we're still trying to get to grips with. But playing these games in the warm-up, so playing Japan and playing Romania, and last summer playing sort of Georgia and Portugal and Romania, those games are there to do just that. They're there to help us deal with those situations, become more experienced in those situations when we're expected to win, but also to give us some winning momentum. And that's what we're talking about here, is going into a World Cup against those two, New Zealand and France, on the back of 4 wins. And that's what we want. That's what we need. And if we do that, who knows? And I think just going back to the ideal of this World Cup, I think if I've gone through the whole bracket myself, predicting everything that could happen, and I think if New Zealand were to beat France in the first game, and we were in a position where we've already won the 2 games and France have lost to New Zealand, and we're coming up in that final game to playing France, and France need to win to go through, that's the perfect scenario for us. So yeah, it's all a learning curve, this very young side, and there are going to be ups and there are going to be downs. That sort of comes with the territory. So hopefully we'll learn plenty from these warm-up games, and then go into that World Cup and be fearless.
And again, no one would begrudge them if they did kind of get as far as you say. Now, this might be an Italian preview and all that, but I'm still going to ask you for predictions, lads, because it's the biggest show in town. And I'll start with yourself, so who do you see winning the World Cup come October?
So I've predicted it all. I went through the other day. I got very bored, and I predicted it all. And you'll be very pleased to know that I have Ireland to win it. Now, I'm very wary of Ireland's Rugby World Cup record, and a lot of people are saying, does that sort of? And I think it's impossible to say that mentally that wouldn't affect the side. We're having that sort of record at World Cup, sort of going into the last 2 World Cups expecting so much more, and not coming out with that. So having seen the way it could go, I really do fancy Ireland. I've got a small suspicion potentially of Argentina doing quite well, but and then we've just seen what New Zealand have all of a sudden just turned it on right at the right moment, haven't they? And playing some exceptional rugby, so you can't write them off either. But I just think Ireland have, barring any injuries, they've got everything they need. They've got wins, they've got experience, they've got talent, they've got everything. They've got the game to beat everybody. So I just think if they can mentally dig deep and sort of get over those demons, me personally, I think Ireland will go to France, and I think they'll finally win it.
Hopefully, I'll start crossing my fingers now.
Sorry if I've jinxed it already. I do apologize.
Someone was bound to say it. There's going to be enough podcasts amongst every channel that someone was bound to say it. So it's not going to be just you. But if it is, we'll know where to find you. Mike, who do you see lifting the web, Ellis?
I think, as we said, the most settled teams are the ones that are going to have the best opportunity to win it, and I think that's between France and Ireland. I think, I think the French have better depth in certain key positions than Ireland. Being sort of completely candid, I think if we're looking at fly half, for example, we're at an opportune time to see this, these warm-ups, how you guys fare without Sexton, who, not to sound cliche, it's always been a bit of a question mark. And, there is a marked improvement when Sexton is playing because he is that good. He is so good. Whereas actually, if you look at France, the drop-off, arguably, it's actually a step up. And the fact that Ntamack is playing with Dupont is because they play at club level. So we were talking about settled team and particular spines, that Toulouse spine, and obviously you guys have that Leinster spine. For me, like I said, I think they just have more depth. My one concern is how all that Latin flair and Latin fire manifest itself in a full stadium. So that's sort of my one concern. But I think, for me, France ever so slightly over Ireland.
And I'd just like to add that I would just absolutely love to see France win in France. I think for rugby and the way the style of rugby they play, to see them win it in Paris would be a pretty special moment. So I wouldn't mind that at all.
That's actually, it's funny you mentioned it, because that is something we mentioned on the last podcast, that if France did it, it would be kind of a romantic victory. But of course, we'll all be rooting for Ireland all over here anyway. So, and listen, lads, thank you so much for that, because I don't think you'll find too many Irish rugby podcasts that'll have an Italian eye this week of all weeks. So it's great to have you on. And as I referenced at the top of the show, this is our final team preview for a specific team in Pool A. And we will look at Uruguay and Namibia at a later date. Next week, we will jump into Pool B with Ireland's opponents, South Africa and Scotland. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, over on my website, kaelansrugby.wordpress.com, you can find my preview article of Saturday's game, which will be going up tomorrow will be going up on Friday. And on Sunday, we will look back on the game in a special recap pod with Ulster and Ireland fans, Jack Fogarty and Ross Barnett. So thanks home to everyone for listening. Thanks once again to the lads for joining us. If you like what you see or hear, please do subscribe. You can find the links for my channels below, and you can also find the links for the lads' Twitter and for their Fratelli to Rugby podcast, which I would highly recommend if you're a connoisseur of Italian rugby. But for now, until next time, take it easy.